September 19th, 1944. First light crawls over the low, wet fields outside Arracourt, France, and the land looks harmless. Quiet farms, hedgerows, shallow rises, patches of woods that hold the night like a secret. But the silence is a lie. In the gray before sunrise, German engines are already turning over in the mist. Steel tracks bite into soft ground. Crews speak in short, tight sentences inside armored hulls. Breath fogging on periscopes, hands numb around levers and throttles. This is not a probing raid. This is a hammer swing. Germany's 5th Panzer Army, throwing a concentrated armored counteroffensive meant to crush Patton's bridgehead, rip open the American line, and stop the Third Army's drive before it can threaten the Saar, one of the last great industrial regions still feeding the Reich's war machine. By the time the sun should have been warming the countryside, the battlefield will be littered with burning Panthers and wrecked assault guns. German officers will struggle to explain how their newest tanks, crewed by veterans, could be mauled by American Shermans that, on paper, should not be winning this fight. And somewhere behind the front, in the layers of headquarters that still cling to the fantasy of reversal, a furious Hitler will demand answers that no one can deliver without admitting the truth. In the West, the old rules are breaking. The Americans are not the amateurs of the early war anymore. They have learned how to hunt. In the weeks after the breakout from Normandy, Patton's Third Army had been a moving storm. Towns fell, crossings were seized, German rearguards were rolled aside, and the front was pushed so hard and so fast that even Allied planners sometimes struggled to keep up. The advance into Lorraine toward the Moselle River and the approaches to Nancy carried a menace far beyond the map lines. If Patton could widen his bridgeheads, if he could keep the pressure on, the road into Germany's industrial heart would not stay closed for long. For Hitler, who hated retreat more than he feared defeat, this was intolerable. He demanded an immediate counterstroke, something decisive, something that would restore the idea of German armored supremacy and punish the American commander who seemed to move with unnatural speed. The order fell to General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army. Manteuffel was not a dreamer. He was one of Germany's most capable armor commanders, a professional who understood what tanks could do and what they could not when conditions turned against them. Yet even he received the same poisonous instruction that came down to so many German commanders by late 1944. Attack, regardless of cost. To make it possible, Berlin scraped together forces it could barely spare. Panzer brigades 111th and 113th, fitted with Panthers, vehicles that German propaganda still insisted were among the finest medium tanks on Earth. Additional strength came from Panzer Grenadiers and elements drawn from other formations, enough to form a concentrated blow of roughly 262 tanks and assault guns. The plan sounded like classic German doctrine: a hard thrust on a narrow front, a rupture, then exploitation into the rear, encircling forward units, collapsing the bridgehead, forcing Patton to halt and dig in. Arracourt looked like the seam. American forces appeared spread, thin, perhaps tired from relentless movement. German intelligence believed American armor could be overwhelmed if struck cleanly and fast. There was confidence in German crews too. Confidence built on steel. The Panther's 75mm gun could punch through a Sherman at distances where the American tank could barely respond. Panther armor, especially from the front, was a brutal problem, and many German crews had years of combat behind them. Hard-earned skill forged in the East, in France, in the long retreat that had taught them how to kill and survive. What the Germans did not understand was that they were not walking into the kind of American force They remembered from the first clashes in North Africa. They were walking into an army that had studied its own bruises, improved its procedures, and built a system of war that made individual tank superiority less decisive than it had once been. The Americans facing them, elements of the 4th Armored Division, including Combat Command A, were outnumbered, roughly 163 tanks against 262 German armored vehicles. But they held advantages the German planners had discounted as secondary. They had reconnaissance that mapped approaches and dead ground. They had artillery plans already registered and ready to fire within minutes. They had radios everywhere, tanks, infantry, observers, so coordination could happen in real time instead of by messengers and guesswork. And above all, when the weather allowed, they had tactical air power that turned daylight movement into a gamble for any German column. On the evening of September 18, 1944, American reconnaissance reported ominous signs: vehicle movement, the clank and rumble of armor in the distance, the kind of massing that meant something big was coming. Observers watched roads and tree lines, and the reports came in with growing certainty. Combat Command A went to full alert. Shermans were positioned in hull-down defilade, hulls hidden behind folds in the earth, turrets exposed just enough to fire. Crews loaded ammunition and checked radios until the motions became ritual. Men studied terrain by memory and by map, making mental notes of where a tank could slip behind a rise, where a hedgerow could hide a flank move, where an enemy might appear in a field at dawn. They knew what the Panther was. They knew what it could do at long range. And they knew their best chance was to deny it that kind of fight. There is a moment before a battle when both sides still believe the future is flexible. When plans feel like weapons and confidence feels like armor. That night, German commanders briefed their crews on objectives and routes, sure that mass and surprise would be enough. American tankers, more cautious, focused on the ugly details: angles, distances, likely fields of fire, the timing of artillery calls, the locations of observers. Weather forecasts promised fog at dawn. To German ears, fog sounded like concealment. To American defenders, fog sounded like a trap, especially for attackers who had to find their way through unfamiliar ground. At about 6 in the morning on September 19, 1944, dense fog lay over Arracourt like a lid. Visibility dropped so low that the landscape became a narrow tunnel of shapes and shadows. The German advance began with the 113th Panzer Brigade pushing forward, Panthers and supporting vehicles groping ahead. They believed the fog would mask their approach, but the fog did something more cruel. It hid the Americans too, and it erased the attackers' ability to coordinate. German tanks bunched on narrow roads and lanes, trying to maintain cohesion, unable to see flanks, unable to identify subtle rises and folds that could swallow a vehicle whole. Engines echoed and carried. Tracks chewed mud. And the defenders, sitting still in prepared positions, heard them coming long before they saw them. When the first German tanks emerged out of the whiteness, they did so at distances that shattered the Panthers' greatest advantage. The fight snapped from theory into violence at ranges sometimes under 100 meters. At that distance, the Sherman's gun, so often mocked for its limitations, could penetrate where it needed to. And American crews could fire before German gunners even understood where the threat was coming from. The first shots were not heroic duels. They were ambushes. A lead tank would lurch as a round punched into it, then flame or smoke would bloom, and suddenly the road behind it was blocked by a dead, burning mass of steel. In close fog, a knocked-out vehicle was more than a loss. It was a barricade. The column behind slowed, stopped, tried to reverse, tried to push around, and the whole advance began to knot and fray. German commanders attempted to deploy into assault lines, but fog and unfamiliar terrain made control almost impossible. Individual Panthers found themselves isolated in pockets of visibility, confronted by multiple Shermans firing from different angles. The Americans did not try to win by proving their tank was better. They won by refusing to fight the fight the Panther wanted. They avoided frontal engagements when they could. They maneuvered for side shots. They used numbers and coordination. 3, 4, 5 tanks, focusing on one enemy vehicle until it was disabled. They called artillery to disrupt movement, to panic crews, to force hatches shut, and blind vision blocks with dirt and smoke. In that close-range chaos, technical superiority mattered less than who saw first, who communicated faster, and who could bring more weapons onto one point in less time. By mid-morning, the 113th Panzer Brigade was being shredded. German losses climbed with a speed that felt unreal. The survivors began to withdraw in disorder, abandoning disabled vehicles, leaving hulks in fields and along hedgerows. Fog, the ally they thought they had purchased from the sky, had turned into an accomplice of the defense. It created the kind of fight that punished movement and rewarded preparation. American losses, by comparison, were astonishingly light. Only a handful of tanks destroyed, a number so small it sounded like a clerical error when first reported. As the fog began to lift later in the morning, the battlefield revealed itself like a nightmare being pulled into daylight. Burned-out German tanks sat at odd angles, tracks thrown, turrets twisted, black smoke smearing the sky. American tankers counted wrecks with a mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. The Germans had come to crush them, and instead they had been stopped cold, shattered in the very first surge. But German pride does not die quickly, and German headquarters did not accept failure as a final report, especially with Hitler demanding action. Surviving forces were reorganized for an afternoon assault. The 111th Panzer Brigade, held back earlier, received orders to renew the attack. This time, the Germans tried to be cautious, to use distance, to force the fight back into the range where the Panthers' gun and armor could dominate. Tanks approached more carefully, seeking long lines of sight, trying to engage from positions that would make Shermans pay. American commanders anticipated it. They called for air support. And when the weather permitted, the sky, so often silent in German planning, became a weapon in American hands. P-47. Thunderbolts arrived low and fast, carrying bombs and rockets designed to maul armored vehicles. German tanks, caught in open terrain, became targets that could not hide. The pilots dove through scattered anti-aircraft fire, released ordnance that smashed tracks, ruptured hulls, and set vehicles ablaze. Even when a tank was not destroyed outright, the shock and fear of air attack forced crews to scatter, to halt, to abandon good positions, to seek cover where none existed. By late afternoon, the second assault had been crippled. The Germans had paid again. The total losses for that day rose into a scale that sounded impossible. Scores of tanks destroyed or disabled, while American losses remained painfully small by comparison. German after-action reports tried to make sense of it. Some claimed ambush, some blamed fog, some blamed air power. All of them circled the same reality without daring to name it plainly. The Americans had fought as a system. Tanks, artillery, infantry, reconnaissance, radios, and aircraft had functioned like parts of one machine. The Panthers were formidable, but they were not fighting a duel. They were being hunted. When reports reached German high command, the first reaction was disbelief. Numbers like this were not supposed to happen to Germany. Not with Panthers. Not with experienced crews. Not against American Shermans. Yet additional confirmations arrived. Division headquarters, regimental commanders, even reconnaissance. The catastrophic scope could not be hidden. 2 Panzer brigades had been mauled in a single day. The counteroffensive meant to stop Patton had collapsed in the very act of striking. German officers, analyzing what happened, identified the obvious factors first. American air superiority, which turned daylight movement into punishment. Artillery coordination, which disrupted advances and shattered cohesion. And the American combined arms system that made every attack feel like it ran into a wall of synchronized violence. But the deeper wound was psychological. German armored doctrine had long assumed that technical superiority and tactical excellence could compensate for enemy material advantage. That belief had been a pillar, something they could lean on even as factories were bombed and fuel became precious. Arracourt cracked that pillar. American forces had demonstrated tactical skill equal to Germany's best, while also possessing the mass, supply, and support Germany could no longer match. That psychological reversal mattered. Before Arracourt, Panther crews often entered battle with confidence bordering on arrogance. After Arracourt, caution crept into German decision-making. They became more defensive, more hesitant to close distance, more inclined to fight at maximum range, and then withdraw rather than press. It was a subtle shift, but it contradicted the aggressive principles at the heart of German armored warfare, and it further degraded their effectiveness. A tank force that is afraid to risk is a tank force that cannot seize opportunity. And by late 1944, opportunity in the West was disappearing anyway. In post-war interrogations and recollections, German commanders offered candid assessments. Manteuffel acknowledged the quality of the American defense and the skill of American tank commanders, emphasizing that the result was shaped by combined superiority: numbers, artillery, air power, and tactical competence. Balck admitted that German forces underestimated how quickly American proficiency had improved since earlier defeats, and how effectively the Americans now employed combined arms tactics, once considered a uniquely German strength. Intelligence officers pointed to the American learning curve, how quickly they absorbed lessons from disasters like Kasserine, how ruthlessly they corrected errors, how they built doctrine around coordination rather than individual heroics. Other veterans wrote of the eerie experience of feeling hunted, of entering what should have been a confident offensive and discovering the defenders already knew the terrain, already had fire plans, already had radios calling steel and thunder down on every approach. All of this happened within the larger shadow of Patton's war, because Arracourt did not occur in isolation. It occurred in the wake of a commander who demanded speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. Patton's name hovered over every German decision in that sector, because his reputation had become a kind of psychological artillery. German headquarters feared what he might do if not checked. They feared his ability to exploit any crack, any hesitation, any delay. That fear pushed them toward desperate counterstrokes. Arracourt was one of those counterstrokes, an attempt to impose a halt on a force that seemed incapable of stopping. Yet there's an irony that makes Arracourt more than just a tally of tanks destroyed. The battle did not prove that the Sherman was superior to the Panther. It proved something far more important and far more modern: that war is not a contest of single weapons. It is a contest of systems. American doctrine favored producing large numbers of reliable tanks, then integrating them into a combined arms machine supported by artillery, engineers, infantry, reconnaissance, air power, and a logistics pipeline that could keep the whole thing moving. German doctrine, once brilliantly flexible, was increasingly trapped by shortages, rigid orders, and the fantasy that a superior machine could overcome strategic collapse. At Arracourt, That fantasy burned in fields outside a small French town. And in the American story, the battle became part of a legacy that extended beyond a single division or a single commander. Leaders like Crichton Abrams, aggressive, adaptive, and relentless, embodied the kind of armor leadership the United States was forging in the crucible of 1944. Abrams's methods, rapid maneuver, concentration of force, precise coordination with supporting arms, became templates for future doctrine. Decades later, when a new American main battle tank was named the Abrams, it was not just a technical honor. It was a tribute to a way of fighting, fast, coordinated, and brutal when necessary. Patton's legacy lives in that same thread, not merely in speeches or headlines, not merely in the mythology of ivory-handled pistols and hard language, but in the operational ethos he pushed. Exploit momentum, refuse paralysis, force the enemy to react until reaction becomes collapse. Patton did not personally command every tank at Arracourt, but the battle occurred inside the broader reality he created. An American army moving so aggressively that Germany felt compelled to gamble armor it could not replace. Patton's presence shaped German choices the way a storm shapes the decisions of sailors, and the American combined arms style that crushed those German gambles, fast coordination, aggressive local leadership, disciplined use of artillery and air, was exactly the kind of war Patton believed would win. Arracourt also carried a quieter lesson about transformation. The United States Army that fought in the fog on September 19, 1944, was not the same army that had stumbled earlier in the war. It had learned to turn weakness into method. It knew its tanks were vulnerable in a straight duel, so it refused the duel. It used terrain, numbers, radios, artillery, and teamwork. It used speed of decision and speed of communication. It created situations where the Panthers' advantages could not fully express themselves. And when German armor tried to recover and strike again, the Americans did not simply endure, they adapted and punished. By the time the smoke drifted away from the wrecks, the meaning of the battle was already spreading through German ranks like a sickness. It was not just the loss of tanks, it was the loss of certainty. When German tankers began to believe that technical superiority no longer guaranteed victory, when they began to believe that the Americans could match their tactical skill and overwhelm them with support, then the war in the West became something else. It became a long, grinding retreat where victory was no longer pursued, only delay. A veteran would later capture it with a sentence that felt like confession. After Arracourt, the predator realized it had become prey, and in the larger arc of 1944, that realization mattered. It meant Patton's Third Army, despite inevitable pauses and supply strains, remained an existential pressure on Germany's Western defense. It meant German counterstrokes would increasingly resemble desperation rather than doctrine. It meant the American system, imperfect, often costly, sometimes blunt, was learning how to strike with a precision that made even elite enemy formations bleed out in hours. Arracourt did not end the war. It did not break Germany's will overnight. But it marked a moment when the German high command confronted a truth it had resisted for too long. The Americans were no longer simply arriving with numbers. They were arriving with competence. They were arriving with a method that turned fog into an ally, terrain into a weapon, and coordination into a killing force. And because Patton's broader campaign demanded the enemy respond on his terms, fast, violent, relentless, Arracourt became part of the legacy of the man Germany most wanted to stop. Not because he was invincible, but because he made them fight when they could not afford to, and he forced them to gamble what they could not replace. That is why Arracourt still matters when people speak of Patton. It is not just a tank battle. It is a snapshot of an army evolving at speed, of American armor proving it could outthink a technically superior opponent, and of German confidence cracking under the weight of reality. In the midst of a French dawn, the myth of untouchable German Panzer dominance met an American system designed to learn, coordinate, and destroy. The outcome was written in smoke across the fields, an answer Hitler could not accept, and a warning